So today we're going to talk about glaze and underglaze. We have three different products in our studio: underglaze, wonderglaze, and glaze. The first product is underglaze, which is matte. It can be used like paint. It goes underneath any kinds of shiny glazes. If you want to do a glossy clear coat, you can mix the colors into whatever colors you want. Stroking coat or the Wonder Glaze can also be used like paint. However, it is shiny when it's fired, and both of these products can be used on bisqueware or greenware. Glaze has to be used on bisqueware, so it must be fired once, and it creates a glossy surface, and most of the glazes we have these really unique crystals in them. I have these test tiles that you can look at to make sure you like how the glaze looks. They can be layered and mixed with one another to create unique finishes, as you've seen in some of the other videos that we've watched. Wax resist is something to use to protect your piece where you don't want glaze going, so maybe the bottom if you want to keep it completely clean, or if you want to create different types of resist patterns, which was also discussed in some of those other videos on techniques. There are special brushes that you must use for wax. You can use a chopstick to stir the glazes. Make sure you get all the little chunks out of the from the bottom of the glaze jar. We have a variety of different brushes. Any of the brushes with the teal handle, as seen here, are used for glaze. Okay, so don't use these for regular paint. Okay, and you can use different sizes depending if you want to create details or if you just want a really quick coverage to get started. When you're ready to glaze your piece, you want to first take a clean sponge. I will have specific sponges labeled with a G for glaze, and you will use that to wipe down your whatever you're going to glaze. So this is from a couple years ago. It actually had dust inside, so it's definitely very important to do this. Also, sometimes there's dust from the firing process and all of that. Before you do this, also make sure your pot sits on the table nice and neat. If it doesn't and it kind of wobbles, you can scrub it on a piece of sandpaper to smooth out your foot so that it has a nice secure bottom. So you're just going to take a damp sponge, not soaking wet, just damp, and you're just going to quickly wipe down any dust and or fingerprints that may be on it. And before you do this, you want to make sure your hands are clean, you know, no Dorito dust on your fingers. Okay, so that's it. First, you wipe down your pot with a clean, damp sponge. Make sure it is not a sponge that is loaded with clay. Okay. And so just like we took care of our paint brushes when we were painting, we want to make sure that we clean our brushes from the glaze. It will not damage the brush if the glaze dries in the brush. However, it can ruin someone else's project. So let's say you left this brush and the glaze dried in it, and someone else went to use this thinking that it was a clean brush, then whatever glaze is on this brush would then be on their project, and they might not want that. Okay, I use the chopstick to stir my glaze. The chopsticks we can reuse, so just rinse that off, make sure the glaze is all removed from the chopstick. And just like we did with our regular paint brushes, you can swirl them around in your hand, clean off the handles as well, make sure there's no glaze caked onto the handles, and make sure that the water runs clear after you're done rinsing your brush. And as always, we leave it to dry, bristle side up. I will make sure that there is a little cup by the sink for your glaze brushes. Now, the glaze brushes are not to be used with regular paint. They are not to be used with clay, and they are definitely not to be used with wax. I have specific brushes designated for the wax if you are doing anything with a wax resist. So I'm taking the time to make sure my brushes are clean. I'm reforming my bristles so that they're not wonky. And the fan brushes are really nice and soft, right? So I want to make sure I get all of that glaze out. The brush should be back to sort of that creamy white color when you are done cleaning it out. Okay, so nice and gentle. Shake out the excess, and reform it back into a nice fan. And I'll finish cleaning these guys. Again, always leave them to dry, bristle side up. Thanks. So it's really important to plan out which glazes or which processes you're going to use. It's really also important to keep a glaze record. So this is in your sketchbook or on a piece of paper where you write down what glazes you use. This is an example of glaze gone wrong, where there was too much applied and it dripped off of the pot and it created these weird drips. This is unevenly applied glaze on the bottom, and you have these like little white spots that are not very attractive. So it's important that when we're glazing, we apply it neatly and cleanly. This one's a little bit better. The bottom is still a little bit messy. Usually when we do this, we want to wipe the bottom completely clean so that it is just the white clay there. This is an example of a nice, well-glazed pot. The glaze doesn't drip. The foot is clean, and the glaze is evenly applied throughout to create a nicely finished pot. So again, keeping a glaze record is really important. We want to keep the bottom of our pieces clean. We can either use wax or sponge. It's really important that we keep the lid on tight before shaking, so I usually like to open it and then close it again and make sure it's closed before I shake it, or you can use a chopstick to stir. When we get started, we want to work on a placemat. We want to make sure we have a piece of paper out so we can keep a glaze record and get our paintbrushes and the glaze colors that we're going to use. Good rule of thumb is always 3 coats of glaze. You want to apply 1 even coat, let it dry completely. You'll know it's dry when it sort of turns like chalky. Okay, the colors will sort of change as it dries. It won't be shiny or wet looking anymore. You need to make sure it dries between each layer. If you are using a glaze that has the crystals in it, make sure those are evenly dispersed on your piece, that you do see those little chunks or crystals in there. Okay, so making sure the lid goes back on in between coats so that the jar does not dry out. Okay, and then making sure that you sketch out your image of your pot or your creature and write down the name and the number of the glaze that you use, where you applied those colors, how many coats you applied, if you layered different colors on top of each other. Make sure you make note of that. It's very important. And again, make sure it dries completely between each layer. If you're just applying wet glaze on top of wet glaze, you're not actually getting that full second coat. So you want to make sure it dries. So here I'm layering on a different color just to see what kind of happens when those glazes mix in the kiln. You can see there it was dry, and you could see that it was kind of a chalky color before that second coat was applied. Okay. And now this melts in the kiln, right? So glaze is made up of flux and silica, and the silica, when it melts, it turns to glass in the kiln. So here I'm showing you some different techniques with the underglaze and the wonder glaze. So you can get a little palette and squeeze out a little bit of the stroking coat, or wonder glaze as they call it. They call it that because it can be used both on bisqueware or greenware. And it works like a paint, but it also fires shiny like a glaze. The orange is underglaze, which again works sort of like a paint. The colors are relatively true. When it fires matte. So if you want your piece to be shiny, you do need to cover it with a clear coat. Here I'm using a sponge to kind of create a stain of that color. So it's kind of sitting in the texture on the pot. So there's a million different ways you can apply glaze. So there it was underglaze with regular glaze on top. So like I said, a million different ways you can use these together, separately, with wax resist techniques. There's so many cool things that you can do with the glaze to get the effect or the look that you are going for. So it does help if you take some time, do a little research, and figure out what you're doing. Before you close up the glaze for real, make sure you wipe off the lid so that the cap goes on nice and tightly. There I'm using the chopstick to stir just to show you what that looks like. So to review, we have the three different products. Underglaze and stroking coat can be used on both greenware and bisqueware. You can use them either for sgraffito or mishima or wax resist techniques. Velvet underglaze is matte. You can mix the colors, you can blend, you can layer, you can use it like a watercolor paint almost. The stroking coat fires to a glossy finish. It does also work like paint. You can blend, layer, mix colors. It is food safe when fired. The glaze that we have, most of it is food safe, so you can use it for a vessel that you want to eat or drink out of, and it creates sort of a waterproof coating on your piece. So again, step by step, we want to talk about the importance of keeping a glaze record, so keeping notes of exactly what you're applying, where, and how many coats. You want to start by cleaning your hands, and then wiping and dusting the grime off of your bisqueware with a clean, damp sponge, not super wet, just damp. You can apply a wax resist to the bottom or anywhere that you don't want glaze. Then we want to make sure that our lid is on really, really good before we shake our glaze, because sometimes it can explode and it's terrible. Or you can stir it with one of the chopsticks. Then we're going to apply three thin, even coats. We want to vary direction, so you can paint it on horizontally, then let it dry, then vertically, let it dry, and then diagonally. And then when you're all done, you want to make sure the bottom of your piece is clean. Otherwise, when it's fired, the glaze could run and stick to the kiln shelf. We want to make sure it dries completely, and then we want to place it on the proper shelf to be ready to be fired. Another reminder is don't touch it after it's done drying, because you could chip off the glaze and then you might have like a weird imperfection in the finished piece. So let it dry and then just carefully carry it over to the shelf and try not to nick it. Okay, so I hope you enjoy glazing. I hope you have fun picking your colors, and I can't wait to see your finished pieces. Thanks for watching. Please also remember that when you're all done, you need to clean all of your brushes. You need to clean the area where you were working, and you need to make sure that the lids on the glazes are on really, really tight so they don't dry out for the next person. So when you're all done, make sure you clean up after yourselves and put your brushes away and your glazes away and any other materials that you used, and make sure there's no glaze chips or anything left on the table. Thanks.